check your email. I forwarded the attendance form for you, so you can record your attendance. Today we'll have our last lesson of the year, and it's going to be on race in the U.S. Catholic Church. We looked at kind of how discriminatory attitudes form from just making generalizations to them becoming kind of becoming stereotypes, and then when they're combined with negative emotions, they that would be kind of becoming a stereotype. Then when it gets combined with actions and power, it becomes discrimination. And then once it becomes part of our social structures, it's institutionalized racism and institutionalized discrimination. Then we looked at the church's teaching on immigration and looked at the stories of the unaccompanied minors seeking a better life from Honduras. And so today, looking at racism, I figured you've probably already studied the civil rights movement in history class or civics, like the 14th Amendment. You probably, you studied the Civil War junior year. So I thought I would focus our class on issues of like race and ethnicity just within the United States Catholic Church. So that's what we're going to go over today. And I emailed the slides if you want. Made a noise. If you want them, but they're up here as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Oh, there's Mimi. Excellent. Okay. So this is our last lesson, and it'll be on race, also ethnicity as well in the U.S. Catholic Church. So this was the little disclaimer I had at the beginning of our lessons. Discussing racism can be difficult, but if we don't discuss it, we're not going to grow as a nation. If I say anything that you're like, wait a minute, did she just say that? Don't just assume that what I said was what you heard. Ask clarifying questions. If I say something that you think is wrong or is offensive, be sure to tell me afterward. One of the things about white privilege is often white people say things that are stupid and we don't even know how bad they are. And if people don't call us out, we'll never learn. And I'm not saying that as an excuse. That's just the reality. Be open to new ideas and perspectives. Our attitude is one of openness and encounter, rather than being like on the offensive or the defensive all the time. In racial issues, especially for people of color, may remind you of incidences in your life where you've experienced discrimination. So if you need a break, just let me know. So our prayer today is Wake Me Up, Lord, and it's from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So let me put up the chat so we can have our special intentions. Well, I guess I'll just put it there. So let's begin in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. If you have any special intentions at home, you could put them in the chat. Do you guys have any special intentions today? Anybody? Let's see. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? I want to pray a special intention for my husband who has a job interview in a couple hours. St. Joseph the Worker, please give us your powerful intercessions. I also want to say a special intention for a former student, Paul, who lost his grandfather, that you would just be with him to support him and guide him in his college class choices for next year. And for the son of J.D. Flynn, who is having some neurological problems. Let's see, any other special intentions? For all the intentions we hold in the silence of our hearts, we pray to the Lord. Lord, hear our prayer. Wake me up, Lord, so that the evil of racism finds no home within me. Keep watch over my heart and remove from me any barriers to your grace. Oh, that may oppress and offend my brothers and sisters. Fill my spirit, Lord, so that I may give services of justice and peace. Clear my mind, Lord, and use it for your glory. And finally, remind us, Lord, that you said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And for our reflection video, this is an interview with Cardinal Wilton Gregory. Oh,
Cardinal first.
He is the first ever African American cardinal in the history of the Catholic Church. So this is a interview, so you can get to know him. He is the cardinal of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., which is one of the historically where we have certain centers of Black Catholicism in the United States. Chicago, Washington, D.C., New Orleans is the biggest center of Black Catholicism in the U.S. But I thought you should meet Wilton Gregory.
Cardinal, first of all, congratulations. It's been a couple of months now since you stood in front of Pope Francis. What is that moment like?
I was somewhat numb because there were so many thoughts that were going through my mind and heart. I thought about my mom and dad and family members, my grandmother, but it was very humbling.
For Wilton Gregory, the Catholic Church's first ever African-American cardinal, that historic journey to the Vatican began in Catholic school on the south side of Chicago. You knew fairly early on at a young age that you wanted to enter the priesthood.
The priests and the sisters in that parish were just extraordinary human beings. And I was just mesmerized by them. I decided after about 6-7 weeks that I was going to be a priest.
He was ordained in 1973, rising up the ranks in Illinois, serving as the Archbishop of Atlanta for 15 years. In 2019, Pope Francis appointing him Archbishop of Washington before elevating him to Cardinal last fall. Do you think the fact that we finally have an African-American cardinal is somewhat overdue?
When a moment occurs like this, the reaction of a lot of people is, why did it take so long? Well, it took so long because we're still grappling with racism and with exclusion. That's still a part of the world in which we live.
I'm curious, in your journey through the priesthood, have you had to deal with racism?
Oh, sure. I don't know of any African American who hasn't tasted the bitter cup of discrimination. With faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, now, as long as I was formally dressed, I'm treated with great respect and affection. But if I take off my clerics to go out, I'm in the pool of every other African American man in Washington. I can remember on one occasion, maybe 15 or so years ago, and I was being hosted at a very exquisite Palm Springs golf club. And another individual, he said, you can put my clubs on the golf cart. I had to say, well, I can have somebody retrieve your clubs, but I'm here to play golf. I never forgot that. But it's good for me not to lose a grounding in the experience of what it means to be an African-American man in our country.
It's an experience he learned about from a young age when his grandmother took him to the funeral of Emmett Till, the black teenager brutally murdered in 1955. Why did you go?
Well, I was only about 6 or 7, maybe 8, I can't remember. It was, I guess, part of the rite of passage. The wake was attended by just thousands of black people on the south side of Chicago. I mean, it was a defining moment.
Right. Fast forward to today and all the racial unrest and the injustice. How has that affected you and how you minister?
It's sobering because it's a reminder that in spite of all that we've been able to accomplish, the issue is still there.
How do we deal with that?
We have to listen to each other. Dialogue demands both motions. You have to say what's in your heart, but then you have to say, now, what's in your heart? With the real intent of hearing what another says.
It's that spirit of dialogue that Cardinal Gregory says he hopes to have with his most prominent parishioner, President Joe Biden. Last month, the two standing side by side, remembering the lives taken by the coronavirus.
Harmony is a balm that seeks to comfort and strengthen us as a single people.
What message were you trying to convey?
I was just inviting our nation to identify with the fact that if we're going to heal, we have to remember that we have to heal together.
As President Biden starts to lead, do you expect to perhaps lend him any words of advice?
I'm the Archbishop of Washington. He is a Catholic who lives in Washington. I'm his Archbishop. He's not going to be on speed dial, and I hope I'm not on his speed dial, but there will be moments when I will be able to speak to him about faith, about the works that he's trying to accomplish that we can be supportive of, but also areas where we're not going to agree. But I'm going to always try to do it in a respectful way.
In fact, guys, among those areas of disagreement, the church's stance on abortion. In fact, on Inauguration Day, the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops issuing a statement saying some of Biden's policies would, quote, advance moral evils. Cardinal Gregory told me he felt the statement was, quote, ill-timed, and reiterated that the church and the president agree on many other things. But again, the bottom line, dialogue.
I thought that was
So it was really just an honor to sit and talk with him. Just a terrific man of faith. Helps you get back into your faith as well.
That was a phenomenal interview. And for a lot of us who haven't heard him speak before like that, it kind of showed us another picture of him.
It's a great conversation now, especially that anecdote about him on the golf course some years ago. That's going to stay with you.
Yeah.
That was good. All right.
All right. That Wilton Gregory. So the learning objectives for this lesson are, we'll list some of the sins, racial sins of the church. We'll review the church's documents addressing racism. Summarize the church teaching on racism articulated and open wide our hearts. And then the final assignment this year, which we'll actually do in class next class, will be to research a Catholic community of color. So the first part is just background. What has been the U.S. Church's response to racism historically? Okay, so this is kind of like a timeline. So, and I focused on just what the church in the United States has issued because there are different statements from like the Vatican. The church has never produced an encyclical just on like racism or discrimination, but it's touched on racism and discrimination in a lot of its letters. So this is kind of just looking at the U.S. church. So, and there's the kind of the dates that kind of show you what else was going on. And then these are the dates of the different letters. So in 1954, they had the decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. So you remember that was what declared unlawful the idea of segregation and separate but equal. So in 1958, the U.S. bishops issued a document called Discrimination and the Christian Conscience. So this was really their kind of first letter dealing with racial issues in the United States. And it condemns segregation and establishes that all people are equal and that we must love all persons. And one of the criticisms of the church was that it took them 4 years to get a statement out. Then in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and the USCCB issued a statement at that time. And before that, the National Black Conference of Catholic Charity had issued its own statement, and that led to they issued their own statement. So then you had the USCCB write a letter called the National Race Crisis. And in this letter, the church takes responsibility for its role in the race crisis, and shows concern for institutional racism, not just racism as a personal sin. In this letter, it was mainly talking about how segregation was bad, but the bishops really never addressed racism itself. Here, they're starting to address racism as both a personal sin and the institutionalized structures of racism in our country. Then in 1976, we celebrated the bicentennial, and Joseph Davis, a prominent Black Catholic leader, had his call to action. So in 1979, the USCCB issued an important letter, Brothers and Sisters to Us, and they finally declared racism explicitly as a sin and continued to develop, let me move that, concern for structural racism. So this was the last document the church had issued on race until 2018. And that's when they wrote Open Wide Our Hearts. And so that's the newest document on racism in the United States. And it's right here. It's relatively short. It might look long to you, but it's got lots of like double space and the font's big. So if you're interested in issues of racial justice in the Catholic Church, this would be the most recent document. And actually, if this is an issue you're interested in, there are a lot of up and coming young scholars I follow on Twitter. But one of the problems for Catholics and learning about this issue is there's just not a lot about it. There's three main books. Brian Massingale's Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, very short, very good. There's Cyprian Davis's History of Black Catholics in America. And then there's, what's it called? I'm blanking on it. I forget the author's name as well. There's another one though. I couldn't get it on Amazon. It was, I put it on my wish list for my birthday, but what was it called? I forget, but there's one other one more about Black Catholicism itself. It's not so much about, it's more like a sociological study. So if this is something you're interested in, this could be a great, career for you to study these things, because there's not a lot of people doing it. So Open Wide Our Hearts lists specific racial sins of the church. It does also talk about police violence and gives specific steps for reform. And so Brian Massingale, when he summarizes Open Wide Our Hearts, he picked out 7 themes. So, and we're going to go over Open Wide Our Hearts today in class. I think Sister John Mary had her students do a reading guide, but she didn't do the immigration lesson. I didn't want to lose the immigration lesson, so I'll just review it in class with you today. So the themes, this is themes from Brothers and Sisters and Us, sorry. So this was before Open Wide Our Hearts. The bishops touched on the persistence of racism despite statutory changes. And what that means is, one of the things that the Catholic Church can bring to the conversation is the issue of sin. Because if racism is just about changing laws and social structures, we keep doing that, but racism isn't going away. We have to change people's minds and hearts too. The covert existence and subtle nature of contemporary racism, the link of racism to economic injustice, the institutional character of racism. They address ecclesial racism. Ecclesial refers to the church. So racism within the Catholic Church, like remember when we learned about St. Martin de Porres during National Black Catholic History Month, he couldn't even become a priest because there was a time when Black folks weren't allowed in the seminaries. The doctrinal basis for the Catholic stance, and then they had recommendations for action. So what we're going to go over today is some of the main points of Open Wide Our Hearts. And there's a link in the presentation if you want to read it. I think I forgot to put it on Schoology, but as soon as Schoology is back up, I'll put it up there. Because one of the things like people will say, well, like the church doesn't say anything about this and the church doesn't say anything about that. And it's like, that's all the church does is say stuff about stuff. I mean, we got documents on everything. You just have to go and find them. So if you if you want to know what the church says about racism, this is what it says. So first thing they did was they listed some of the racial sins of the church. In terms of chattel slavery refers to the type of slavery is practiced in the United States, because slavery has always existed. Of course, we see it in the Bible, but the way slavery was done in the United States is very different from slavery we'd seen anywhere in history or anywhere else around the world. The church, they admit, allowed for and did not stand up enough against slavery. So when you look at the church's historical stance on slavery, it has a mixed record. Largely, most of the documents from the church and the teachings from the church are against slavery. But you do have examples where, for example, and this is a quote from Open Wide Our Hearts. The truth is that sons and daughters of the Catholic Church have been complicit in the evil of racism. And his papal bull Dum Divaris, Nicholas V granted apostolic permission for the kings of Spain and Portugal to buy and sell African slaves, setting the stage for the slave trade. Even though subsequent popes strongly renounced and rejected the international slave trade, much to our shame, many American religious leaders, including Catholic bishops, failed to formally oppose slavery. Some even owned slaves. And you may have heard in the news, the Jesuits, the religious order of your brother's school, they're actually coming up with a plan to pay reparations because the Jesuit order in the U.S. did own slaves. So the church has admitted its complicity in the slave trade. And I don't want it to, there were lots of Catholics also fighting against it. But, you have to kind of see both sides of it. Segregation, the church participated in segregation and at one time barred Black men from the seminary. Silence, the church, wait, I think there were images. Where did they go? Oh, there they are. The church turned a blind eye to the sins of racism and failed to protect the most vulnerable in her flock. And paternalism. So they included in Open Wide Our Hearts, not just like in the United States, historically, we often see racism as kind of a black-white issue. But there's other folks who are discriminated against, whether by their gender, their sexuality, their ethnicity. So the church also admitted, for example, that a lot of the missionaries, like when Junipero Serra came out here to evangelize, they treated the indigenous people with paternalism and racism. And paternalism is when the European colonizers, or I don't know what's called, the colonizers, they would treat the indigenous people not like they had equal dignity, but they would treat them like children, or even worse, like they would call them like savages, So the church admitted that this was a failure on the part of the missionaries to treat the people they were ministering to as having equal dignity. Let me make sure there's no questions. Okay, so in terms of our doctrine, what does the church say about racism today? And again, there are other things that have come out from the Vatican. I'm just focusing on the U.S. So racism is a sin, period. This is a quote from Open Wide Our Hearts. Racist acts are sinful because they violate justice. They reveal a failure to acknowledge the human dignity of persons offended, to recognize them as neighbors Christ calls us to love. The church teachings on some more church teachings. So they continue to emphasize the idea of structural racism. So the church has always taught that sin isn't just like a personal thing. It becomes institutionalized, and what is often called structural or institutionalized racism, the church is always called structure of sin. And we also identify other structures of sin. We would say poverty is one, war is one, things like that. In Open Wide Our Hearts, they also acknowledge the idea of white privilege. So the church also notes that these structures lead to white privilege and supremacy, even if only unconsciously. And so you might have already learned, I don't know if you learned about white privilege in your other classes, but this is a term that recognizes a reality of our culture, that if you're white, you have a certain level of privilege. And it's not, when I first heard the term, I was like, hey, wait a minute. I grew up poor. I was on free lunch. I was raised by a single mom. I'm like, I'm not privileged, but it's not something that doesn't mean that you have more money or something like that. It's about having a certain access in society that's set up just based on the structures of our society. So here's a little CBS News story that will kind of explain how this works and how it is structured into American society. Let's see. Oh, I guess I'll leave that up there. Whoop. Oh, come on. There we go. Poodles. Right. Uh-oh. Oh, poodles. Come on, you silly thing. This is a really good little news story. Trout. Oh, snap. Oh, poodles. Okay, let's see. Let's hope it works. Come on, St. Isidore Seville. Whoa. Hey. I just want to watch the show. Well, maybe maybe I'll try to come back to this at the end of class. Did you learn about like redlining in any of your history classes? Yeah. So we'll see if this video ever starts working. So let's see, it's this part of it's this stupid computer. So if you look at, for example, in the US, the wealth gap between white families and black families, and you ask the question, why is there this huge...
My grandfather had an amazing life, but Ancestry showed me so much more than I could have imagined. My grandfather was born in a shack in Pennsylvania. His father was a miner. They were immigrants from Italy. And somewhere along the way, that man changed his name and transformed himself into a successful mid-century American man. He had a whole life that I didn't know anything about. He was just my beloved grandpa.
Bring your family history to life like never before. Get started for free at Ancestry.com.
Back now at 7:30, and the White House said this week it supports the study of reparations for black Americans. In Congress, H.R. 40, that's a bill, would examine the history of slavery and discriminatory government policies and suggest ways to address inequality. Consider this: the typical white household has about 10 times the accumulated wealth of the typical black household. It's an issue we began looking into last summer on the campaign trail, and we found what many scholars say is the root of this racial wealth gap. It's not entirely in slavery or some century-old wrong, but in fact in the modern suburbs, and it touches on my own family's history.
In 1953, my grandfather, Rudy DeCopel, became a homeowner, moving my grandmother and 3 kids, including my dad, out of a tiny apartment in Manhattan and into a new house in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, one of America's growing suburbs. After World War II, millions of families made a similar move.
Families are pursuing the American dream to give their children a better chance in life.
A lot of them were masons, carpenters, farmers.
Working class.
Working class.
Proudly so.
Definitely.
Bob Jangeruso is the mayor of Lyndhurst and a lifelong resident.
We had great childhood here. It's priceless.
One of the best places you could ever imagine to grow up.
And Joe Cafone, a retired police officer, is an unofficial town historian.
It sounds like a classic American suburb.
That's it. That's exactly. That's a really good way to put it.
But America's suburbs have another story, less often told, about who was able to buy these homes and benefit from that boom time economy, and who was not.
It's just a remarkable record of exclusion.
David Trout is a law professor at Rutgers University, Newark.
It is not accidental, and it is not just a question of bad attitudes. It's a question about inequitable rules.
From the 1930s to the 1960s, the major federal programs that developed the suburbs and guaranteed mortgages were for whites only, first as a matter of policy and later in practice. Redlining, for example, is a term that comes from these 1940s-era maps adopted by the Federal Housing Authority. Green, blue, and yellow areas were typically eligible for government-backed loans and investment. The red areas were not, leaving them starved for resources. And as I looked back at Lyndhurst and the surrounding county, where my great-grandparents also owned a home, I noticed those redlined areas had a lot in common.
They were anywhere from 45% to 95% Negro, the term used. Some had wells spoiled by typhoid. Some did not have city gas or utilities going to all the properties. Some were divided off by a railroad line or an elevated train, so physical segregation in addition to everything else. Any of that surprise you?
Not at all. In fact, you can multiply those findings across the country. Those who were fortunate enough to enjoy the largesse of this government were able to see benefits accrue over generations, which they could then share with their children and their grandchildren. And so to be left out of that process of household wealth accumulation has been devastating for black families.
By 1950, about half the new home purchases in America were made with government-backed loans. But 98% of them went to white buyers. And among veterans like my grandfather in the lucrative New York, New Jersey area, it was more than 99%. It's an uncomfortable fact that families like mine are only just beginning to face.
Wait a minute, you're telling me they were only going to mortgage white people?
Yeah. Yeah.
For you to say that Lyndhurst is the way it is, because it almost implies that Lyndhurst was racist.
No, this is my family too. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we had no idea.
You're right. Most people would not have known that the federal government had this program in place.
A lot of people did not know.
But a lot of people, Lee Porter among them, were personally, physically aware that racist policies prevented black families from moving into highly desired neighborhoods.
I didn't call it redlining, but yeah, that's what it was.
What did you call it?
We call it, this is the area that persons of color can live.
At 94 years old, Porter still runs the Fair Housing Council of Bergen County.
You've been called the mother of fair housing in New Jersey.
I don't know how that happened.
She's been here since the 1960s, when she and her husband were blocked from buying homes they could afford.
How did you feel when you found out that real estate agents were steering you away from the White Houses?
I was quite angry about it, but I was persistent. I was determined to get what I wanted, the same as anybody else.
Quite angry sounds like an understatement.
We managed, we did okay.
But black families who couldn't own those nicer homes have not been able to build the same wealth over time. Many Americans, me included, are only just now coming to terms with how big a role our federal government had in enforcing discrimination. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?
The one thing that I'm struggling with, and this is as somebody whose family came through here, is when I looked at the old maps, just over the river, the areas were redlined by the federal government, meaning they weren't worthy of mortgages, and Lyndhurst wasn't redlined. What do you do with that knowledge?
You move on. Come on, we're God's people.
Now that we do know,
right,
what do we do about it?
You know, that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that, Tony. I wish I did.
That's a very honest answer, too. What are we going to do about it? That's jaw-dropping to me. 98%?
Yeah, 99 in this area.
Went to white families?
99.
So it begins the wealth gap.
That is the origin of the racial wealth gap in this country. This is where history shows up in your wallet.
Yes.
And, you know, Bob and Joe, who I appreciate having a very difficult and uncomfortable conversation with me, they're representative of where most white Americans are today. 80 or 90% don't know what to do about it or think we should just start today and be better in the future. But how do we deal with the past?
How do you catch up, though?
How do you catch up? It's like you start. It's like, okay, we've been running a race, and now we're going to follow the rules of the race, but don't worry about the head start.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a real dilemma because it compounded, as you point out in the piece, over generations.
Yes.
It's not just one family lost opportunity that goes on to their descendants and the descendants after them, and it's gone on, you know, for decades.
And continues. Your professor said it right. A remarkable record of exclusion. But can we just take a moment to acknowledge Lee Porter? I bow down to her. What a class act.
She is the woman who got Senator Cory Booker's family was in Bergen County and got in through her work.
I didn't know it was her.
Yeah. So
it's an amazing piece.
Yeah, thank you.
A lot of people need to see that piece, Tony.
Ask ourselves, what are we going to do about it? The White House is asking Americans to consider it, to study it.
Yeah. So when we talk about the idea of let's see what's going on here. Okay, of white privilege, that's what it's referring to. It's referring to these structures of sin in American society, and it's you know, kind of like it's almost like a thing that you're not even aware of. But the question that asked in the news piece was, okay, now that we're aware of this, what do we do about it? And that's kind of going to be the thing for the question your generation's going to get to answer through going to college and studying, getting your jobs, and now being able to vote and be able to, you know, change the structures of America, hopefully through your participation in the democratic process. And it's one of the, it kind of illustrates one of the reasons why it's hard to make a, any headway with the social justice issues, because they're hard. It's not easy to answer that question. And so people get frustrated by the difficulty. Sometimes I think people shut down because you hear that, and there could be guilt and think, well, people get frustrated and then they don't want to do the hard work of justice, but justice is hard. So this is what the bishops wrote in Open Wide Our Hearts. Racism can be found in our hearts, in many cases placed there unwillingly or unknowingly by our upbringing and culture. As such, it can lead to thoughts and actions that we do not even see as racist, but nonetheless flow from the same prejudicial root. Consciously or subconsciously, this attitude of superiority can be seen in how certain groups of people are vilified, called criminals, or perceived as being unable to contribute to society, even unworthy of its benefits. Racism can also be institutional when practices or traditions are upheld that treat certain groups of people unjustly. The cumulative effect of the personal sins of racism have led to social structures of injustice and violence that make us all accomplices in racism. So other teachings, they also go beyond just like a black-white issue, and they acknowledged other forms of discrimination, such as anti-Muslim discrimination and anti-Hispanic hate. They also called us to consider one of the great gifts the church can bring to the conversation is because we recognize the heroes of our faith. We have saints from every nation, every ethnicity, every race. And so we have all these great spiritual heroes that we have to make sure that our kids know not just about, Mary and St. Joseph. Well, they're people of color anyway. They're from the Middle East. But the kid that our children, have saints of every hue, right? And then they also call us to action. The church called upon Catholics to be advocates for people of color and to work to dismantle the structures of sin in both our church and society. And here's a quote to that end. Racism can only end if we contend with the policies and institutional barriers that perpetuate and preserve the inequality, economic and social, that we see all around us. And one of the kind of things the church brings to the conversation that's a little bit different, and there was an article, I'll have to post it on Schoology. It was in the National Catholic Register, and it was entitled "Only the Church Does Anti-Racism Right." And the bishops also kind of mentioned this idea. We have racism is both a structural problem, which we can fix maybe with better laws, but it's also a personal sin. And part of the reason why, it just keeps coming up in our culture is we have to do both. We can't just fix the structures, we have to fix human hearts. And so the bishops call us to repentance. We cannot have racial reconciliation until we confess our own sins and repent, both as individuals and as a nation. And then we must also acknowledge that racism is caused by our original sin, and we cannot overcome it without God's grace. The reason why human nature is broken, and the reason why human beings seem to always fall into these dividing ourselves instead of uniting ourselves, the church has an explanation for that. We say it's because of original sin. Human nature is broken. But the church also has the cure for that, and that's God's grace. And so as Catholics, we can kind of bring that to the conversation. Okay. So here's a quote about that. Only from a place of humility can we look honestly at past failures, ask for forgiveness, and move toward healing and reconciliation. This requires us to acknowledge sinful deeds and thoughts and to ask for forgiveness. So what we're going to do for the application is I've been kind of focusing on the idea that solidarity requires empathy. So Is Schoology back? Let's see. Let's see what happens. All right, looks like it's back. So this will be our last assignment, and you'll have all of class next time to work on it. And then the rest of the days, you'll just have the time to work on your social justice newsletters. Hang on, let's see, Monday. So, oh, the assignments here, that's kind of small. Let me find it in my drive. Jesus, healer, social justice, and assignment. Here we go. Okay. So I guess I could just read this. The Catholic Church has a checkered history when it comes to her response to communities of color. On one hand, the church has numerous saints of color. I don't know why I capitalized that. From many different cultures. On the other hand, church leaders such as Father Coughlin, this guy was terrible. He was this racist, anti-Semitic guy. Remind us that the church is not free from the personal and institutionally sins of racism and anti-Semitism. This assignment will allow you to experience a community of color in the U.S. Catholic Church. As you learn in Lesson 1, racism is born of ignorance and a lack of empathy. This assignment will enable you to immerse yourself in a community of color in the U.S. Church. So the requirements and learning objectives are to identify a community of color within the U.S. Catholic Church you'd like to learn more about. Example, Black Catholics, Vietnamese Catholics, Mexican Catholics. Summarize a brief history of the community in the U.S. Church. Identify one example on how the church institution supported the community. If you can find an example of maybe where they failed to support that community. Describe a prominent parish and include photos and videos if possible. And so this is an example. I lived right next to this church when I was back home. And I used to walk by it all the time when I walk my kids to the Target. So this is Korean Martyrs Catholic Church in Anaheim. So you can see different St. Joseph statue home visitation. Oh, what's that? Sounds good. So this is an example. You can see their parish and the different things that are going on there. And I don't know what these are. What are these pictures of? What is that? Oh, pledge to let your light shine. I wonder what that's all about. Oh, maybe it has something to do with the racism against Asians. Where is it? Click the battle plan button. I wonder what this is about. Let's find out. What time is it? We have a few minutes. Oh, I just wanted to know what you guys are up to. Should we watch it? Oh, it's 20 minutes. Okay, never mind. Well, I mean, maybe if you're interested, you can look them up. But and consider your cultural heritage. Maybe you could find where are the epicenters of your culture in the United States? Come here, thing. Oh, I'm sorry. This computer is just so slow. Oh, let me get that chat question. Yeah, so is it a group project? Good question. You can, where are those instructions? Okay, yeah, so you can, yeah, you could do it with a group or as an individual, however you like. So the first thing would be to do is spend some time researching. If you want to do it as a small group, give each person kind of a job to do. So you can, like, maybe one person is doing the history part, another person's finding, you know, like a Black parish or a Vietnamese parish or Samoan, whichever culture you want to do. Then you need to assemble all your research into a coherent whole. You could use a Google Slides, make a little video, you could put it all in a Padlet. Remember when we used Piktochart? Those turned out really nice. I don't know if they were easy for you to make or not, but that would be, I think a Piktochart would be a great way to feature a different Catholic community of color. And I was going to have you present them, but we won't have time because they kind of changed the end of the year schedule a little bit. So I'll still look at all of them. You'll turn them into me, but we won't have time to present them. So the rubric is down here and you can like read that on your own. So you'll have all next class to work on it, and it'll be due next, for you guys, it'll be due next Tuesday, but we won't have time to work on it in class because we'll be working on the newsletter. Although I suppose you could use some of your newsletter time to finish it. But, you know, find some people you want to work with, and you have a day in class to do it. And the idea is to get it done that day in class. You're not going to become like an expert in one day, but just to give you an idea of, because one of the things that's so rich about the Catholic Church, and we have a name for it, it's called interculturation. And it's the idea that the Catholic Church is at home and everywhere around the world and in every culture. And what the church does is she will take things from all the cultures and they will be able to become part of the church. And so we have unity and diversity, right? So like my kids, we grew up in a predominantly Vietnamese parish. And so at their school, every year we would have a big Tet festival for Lunar New Year, and they would bring in the dancing, I thought they were dragons. I think my kids told me they were lions. But they would, the Vietnamese community would cook lunch for all the kids. And so all the kids got to eat Vietnamese food, and all the kids would wear their cultural outfits. So most of the kids were Vietnamese, and I couldn't find any Eastern European clothes for my kids to wear. So they wore the Vietnamese, anybody Vietnamese, what's it called? Ao Dai, the dress of Vietnam. And they learned about the Lunar New Year, and we prayed together, and there's such a richness in the Catholic Church. And so think about maybe something you want a different community you would like to learn more about, especially if you know about any communities in Sacramento and Roseville. Like I know there's a lot of Syriac Christians up here, and I took Syriac in college. I drove by one of their churches one day and I was like, Syriac, and I was like, I should go hang out with these people and maybe they could tutor me in my Syriac again. Syriac is an Eastern dialect of Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke, but it uses a different script. It doesn't use a Hebrew script. It almost looks like Arabic, and I can actually sometimes read some Arabic. Let's see if we can find it. Maybe it was in Fair Oaks, but yeah, so there's Syriac Christians. Here's with St. Basil's, Sacramento. Here we go. Oh, they're Orthodox. We need to find a Catholic church. Hang on. Syriac Catholic Church. Let's see. They're Orthodox St. Rose. Oh, Cyril. They have a Facebook page. Wait, Malabar. I think those guys are Indian. What are these guys doing? Yeah, these guys are Indian. Maybe one of you guys should do what? Well, yeah, this is from India. Syriac is different. Syriac Catholic Church. Syriac. Oh, here it is. Chaldean Church. Yeah, Chaldean Catholic Church. So these guys, they were in like the area around Iraq, and a lot of them have been chased out of the Middle East by ISIS. And they worship in the Syriac language. Do they have any pictures of it? History. Man, if you had time, we probably don't have enough time, but we really need to go and see one of their liturgies. What's that? Banquet hall. Well, I guess you could rent their banquet hall. Well, I'm kind of got distracted by the Chaldean Christians here. Any other questions? So yeah, that's what we'll be doing in class. The idea is just to get it done in class. Do as much as you can. I wish they would. Yeah, I wanted to show you what Syriac looked like though. Oh, here's something. See what's in their news. Yeah, but think so. You have time to do it in class. Here it is. Oh, that's a. Hang on. Yeah, I think that is Syriac. Yeah. There's actually a Syriac version of the Bible too called the Peshitta. So these guys in the Zoom are like, get out of here, lady. All right. So any other questions?